I left at night without telling my BF after his sister bullied me and I had to defend myself. When I met Finn, life felt simple and right. We'd been together for 2 years. And he'd been supportive through every long day, setback, and late-night research session while I worked on my PhD. When my lease ended, moving in with him made sense. Finn was supportive, and I felt fortunate. I was at a turning point in my career, wrapping up my degree and diving into a project that would launch right in the city we were moving to. When Finn suggested we stay with his family for a couple of months, I figured it'd be a good way for us both to save money and settle down in the same place before launching into a new life together. His family welcomed me, and while I didn't know them well, they seemed happy to have us. I didn't think there'd be any issues. But the small issues started almost immediately. The first odd thing was noticing the scent on my clothes, a perfume I didn't wear. A few times, I found faint marks on my shirts, almost like deodorant residue. I brushed it off at first, but after it happened again, I mentioned it to Finn, expecting he'd be as weirded out as I was. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably a coincidence or my imagination. That hurt a little, but I figured he'd listen if it happened again. I decided to lock up my things to avoid any further problems. And thankfully, that stopped it. However, the underlying tension with his family, especially his sister, simmered. His sister, who was 10 years older than me, had an intense presence. I was careful around her, sensing that she didn't quite trust me. She had this habit of making jabs about how her family took me in, which felt condescending. I didn't want to start a conflict, so I'd laugh it off or ignore it, hoping she'd warm up. But every day felt a little heavier, a little more strained. One evening, while Finn and I were having dinner with his family, his sister started talking about her past relationships. She proudly recounted stories of putting men in their place, as she phrased it, including some violent altercations. She mentioned it with a kind of smugness that made me uncomfortable. Her brother seemed to find it amusing, but I couldn't laugh along. Something in the way she looked at me afterward felt almost like a challenge. It left a knot in my stomach that lingered for days. As Finn and I continued to settle in, things grew more uncomfortable. There were small, snide comments from his mother about how I'd lucked out by finding a supportive partner like Finn. His sister often found opportunities to mention my lack of financial independence since I was still getting established. Finn would brush off my discomfort, insisting that his family was just teasing. They just need time to warm up, he'd tell me, but the warmth never came. Then, one night last week, everything finally boiled over. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on my project, when his sister walked in wearing a blouse that looked almost identical to one I owned. It wasn't mine, but seeing her in something so similar brought back all the frustrations I'd been holding onto since we'd moved in. My face must have given me away because she immediately confronted me, accusing me of implying that she'd stolen it. Before I could respond, she was standing right in front of me, pressing her knees against mine. I felt trapped, unable to move as she leaned in closer. Finn told her to back off, but he didn't intervene in any real way. She continued, jabbing her finger in my face, yelling that I'd always looked at her like she was less. The words stung, but the physicality of it was what made my blood run cold. I felt myself instinctively push her back, hoping to create some space. She erupted, screaming that I'd hit her. She lunged toward me, and I slapped her in pure defense as she moved closer. Heart pounding, I somehow managed to escape to our bedroom, locking the door behind me. I sat there for hours, waiting for Finn to come, to at least check on me, to tell me it'd be okay. But he never did. In the days that followed, silence settled over the house like a heavy fog. His family didn't address the incident, and Finn barely acknowledged me. I felt like a stranger, isolated and humiliated, left to endure the fallout alone. When I tried to talk to Finn about what had happened, he only shrugged, saying he didn't want to cause more drama. It was clear then, I didn't belong here, and he wouldn't stand up for me. That's when I made the decision. I'd received confirmation of payment from my research project and had enough saved to get by. I'd been holding on to the hope that this living situation was temporary, a means to a brighter future with Finn. But now, Everything felt tainted. I wasn't just escaping his family, I was reclaiming my sense of security. My self-worth. So, last night, I packed quietly while they slept. I took only what I needed and slipped out the front door. My heart racing as I walked down the driveway. I didn't look back. Once I was in the car, I drove with no real destination in mind. Just relief at being away from that house. Eventually, I found a small, affordable motel not too far from the city where I'd be working on my research project. I checked in, locked the door behind me, and finally exhaled. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. Even if it was only temporary. That first night was strange. I kept expecting my phone to light up with a message from Finn. Something acknowledging my absence or asking if I was okay. But nothing came. I thought maybe he'd just been asleep when I left. But as morning stretched into midday, the silence persisted. I went through waves of guilt, anger, and sadness. Part of me still wished he'd call, apologize, or at least give me a sign that he understood how deeply he'd hurt me by choosing his family's side. Or rather by not choosing at all. But another part knew that if he didn't reach out now, he likely never would. In the days that followed, I tried to distract myself by setting up my work environment in the small motel room and outlining what I needed to tackle for the research project. The project itself was exciting, something I'd worked toward for years. It was a multidisciplinary collaboration that had the potential to be a career-defining opportunity. I tried to let the excitement ground me, focusing on the future I'd started building long before Finn and I had made plans together. But in the quiet moments, my mind drifted back to him. We'd made so many promises, plans for trips, for the business he wanted to start, for building a life together. It was hard to accept that all of that was now over. Undone by his silence and his refusal to defend me when I needed him the most. I missed the version of him who'd been my partner. The one who'd been there through my late nights and early mornings as I worked toward my degree. But that version felt like a mirage. A version that had faded as soon as we'd moved in with his family. Eventually, Finn texted me. It was 4 days after I left. And his message was brief. Hey, where are you? Are you okay? No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just that. I stared at the message for a long time, weighing how, or even if, I should respond. It felt like he was skirting around the real issue, acting as if I'd simply gone out for a walk and forgotten to tell him. I knew that if I replied, I needed to be direct, to hold my ground, but part of me was still afraid he'd find a way to downplay it all over again. Finally, I responded. I left because I couldn't stay there anymore. Your family treated me terribly. And you didn't stand up for me. I'm safe, but I need some time to figure out what's next. I reread the message a dozen times before pressing send, nervous about how he'd react. But I knew I'd said what I needed to say. The response came quickly, and it stung. So you just left? Without saying anything to me? That's really mature. I felt my face flush with anger. The frustration that had simmered for days boiled over. And I replied, mature? Finn, your sister physically intimidated me, got in my face, and made me feel unsafe in a place I thought was supposed to be our home. And you sat there, did nothing, and then ignored me. Don't talk to me about maturity. The typing indicator flashed on my screen, then disappeared, only to reappear again a few moments later. His response was longer this time. Look. My family isn't perfect. You knew that when we moved in. But just leaving like this, after everything we've talked about, everything I've done for you, this isn't fair. Fair? I texted back, my fingers shaking. How was it fair to expect me to endure your sister's behavior and act like it was my fault? How was it fair for you to ignore me for days after it happened? Leaving me to feel like a stranger in your family's house? This time, the typing indicator stayed up for a long time. Finally, he replied, I was just trying to keep the peace. I didn't want to choose sides. And there it was, the confirmation I'd been dreading. His loyalty to his family outweighed any commitment to us or my safety. I took a deep breath, typing the words I knew needed to be said. I can't be with someone who won't stand up for me. Finn, I deserve better than that. I've worked hard to build a life I can be proud of. And I won't let your family's toxicity hold me back. There was a long pause. Finally, he replied, "If that's what you want." That last message felt so final, so indifferent, that I realized then just how far apart we had drifted. This wasn't the man I'd thought he was. And I was no longer the woman who would compromise her peace and self-respect to keep someone else comfortable. After that, the silence between us was complete. There were no more messages, no calls, and, oddly, it felt like a weight lifted. I began to focus on myself, rediscovering what I wanted out of life now that the relationship was truly over. My work became a solace, an anchor during those first weeks as I adjusted to my new reality. I threw myself into my project, allowing the challenge and the thrill of it to fill the spaces where my grief once sat. A few months passed, and I'd found a modest apartment not far from where the project was headquartered. It was small and bare, but it was mine. I began filling it with the small comforts I hadn't allowed myself during my time in Finn's family's home: books, soft blankets, plants. It was a simple space, but every piece of it reflected my choices, my tastes, my needs. One evening, while sorting through some belongings, I found a card Finn had given me just before we'd moved in with his family. To our new adventure, he'd written, his words full of hope and excitement. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering how deeply I'd believed in that future we'd planned together. But now, I could see the card for what it was, a relic of a time when I'd been willing to settle for less than I deserved. I tucked the card into a box of keepsakes, reminders of lessons learned, and put it away in the back of a closet. Life moved on, and so did I. Each day brought a little more clarity, a little more strength. I had rediscovered the parts of myself I'd put on hold, the parts Finn's family had dismissed or belittled. I was no longer waiting for someone else to validate my worth or protect my peace. I was doing that for myself now, and it felt liberating. In time, the memories of Finn and his family began to fade. They became stories I'd tell myself, lessons from a past life, stepping stones on my journey to becoming a stronger, more resilient person. I knew I'd carry those lessons with me, but they no longer defined me. And as I looked toward the future, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing I'd finally reclaimed my life on my own terms. As the months passed, I fell into a rhythm that felt deeply mine. I was thriving in my project, learning more every day, surrounded by people who respected and valued me for my work. The satisfaction I felt each day was a stark contrast to the stress and unease I'd felt living with Finn and his family. I often thought back to how much I'd relied on Finn for support and how tied I'd been to the idea that he'd always be there for me. Now, I realized that I'd been compromising parts of myself just to keep the peace with his family. I'd convinced myself that it was just temporary, that we'd soon move on and everything would return to how it had been before. But looking back, I could see that I'd ignored signs, subtle shifts in how Finn treated me whenever his family was involved. He'd downplayed things that mattered to me, disregarded my discomfort, and ultimately left me isolated. Living on my own allowed me to rediscover the strength I'd always had. Each day that I didn't hear from Finn, I felt less tied to the past and more confident in my decision. There were no more cold silences, no more unspoken expectations. Everything about this new life felt authentic and honest, a reflection of what I wanted rather than what someone else expected from me. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in months. Friends who had watched from the sidelines as I'd become more isolated during my time with Finn. They had been patient, offering gentle invitations I'd often declined in favor of Finn and his family. Now, I accepted every chance to catch up, and the warmth of their support was a welcome reminder of what real friendship felt like. One weekend, I met up with my best friend, Mara, at a cozy cafe near my apartment. She'd been my sounding board throughout my relationship with Finn. Even when I hadn't wanted to hear her concerns, Mara had been the first to warn me about the red flags she saw in Finn's family and the way he handled his sister's behavior. But I'd brushed her off, insisting that things would improve once we moved out on our own. "So, have you heard from him?" she asked, looking at me with that gentle, knowing gaze of hers. I shook my head, sipping my coffee. "Not since those texts when I left. I think he's moved on. And honestly, I think I'm okay with that." Mara nodded, smiling a little. "You seem different, happier." "I am," I admitted, surprised by how easily the words came. I thought leaving would break me. I thought I'd feel guilty. But now, I don't. I actually feel free. She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. You finally see what we've all seen for a long time. You're strong. And you've always been able to stand on your own. Finn just made you forget that for a while. Her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after our coffee date ended. I realized that, deep down, I'd been holding on to Finn out of a need for stability and security. I'd convinced myself that his presence in my life made me stronger. But really, I'd been strong all along. I just hadn't trusted myself to see it. As winter faded into spring, I began to envision a future that was mine and mine alone. My project was gaining traction, and I received positive feedback from the research team. The idea that my work could have a real impact thrilled me, and I threw myself into it with renewed energy. It was fulfilling to pour myself into something that mattered, to know that every bit of progress I made was a result of my own hard work and dedication. Then, one afternoon, a message from Finn popped up on my phone. It was short, as if carefully crafted to sound casual. Hey, I've been thinking about you. Can we talk? My heart skipped, but it wasn't the rush I'd once felt hearing from him. Instead, it was a strange mix of nostalgia and distance, as if I were reading a message from someone I barely knew. Part of me felt curious, wondering what he could possibly want to say after all this time. But another part of me knew that revisiting that chapter would be pointless. I thought carefully about my response, taking the time to reflect on what I wanted. Finally, I texted back. I appreciate you reaching out, but I've moved on, and I think it's best for both of us if we keep it that way. After I hit send, I expected to feel a pang of sadness or regret. But there was nothing, only calm, a quiet sense of closure that settled over me like a warm blanket. For the first time, I felt completely at peace with the decision I'd made. I didn't need his validation or his explanations. I had all the answers I needed within myself. In the following weeks, life continued to expand in ways I hadn't anticipated. I joined a local group of women in STEM, finding community with others who shared my passion and drive. The friendships I formed were genuine, built on mutual respect and support. A reminder of the strength that comes from surrounding myself with people who lift me up rather than tear me down. One evening, as I sat in my cozy apartment surrounded by the warmth of my own space, I reflected on everything that had happened. My journey with Finn had been painful, but it had led me here, to a place where I felt grounded and whole. The struggles I'd faced were no longer weights holding me down, they were the foundation of my resilience. I picked up my journal and wrote a letter to my future self. A reminder of everything I'd learned. I wrote about the importance of self-worth, of not sacrificing my values or happiness for the comfort of someone else. I reminded myself that true love and support should never come at the expense of my own peace. And as I closed the journal, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet confidence that no matter what came next, I would face it on my own terms. This was my life, my journey, and it was only just beginning. As the years unfolded, my life took on a richness and depth that I hadn't anticipated in the painful aftermath of leaving Finn. My career flourished, shaped by the passion I poured into my work. Each new project, every collaboration, and each hard-won success was a testament to my resilience. The challenging journey I'd taken to reclaim my independence made every achievement feel deeply personal. A celebration of the choice I'd made to prioritize my well-being and happiness. I had built a circle of supportive friends, colleagues who respected my work, and a community that valued me for who I was. For the first time, my life felt anchored, stable in a way that Finn's presence had never allowed. That chapter was now a memory, a lesson that I carried with gratitude rather than bitterness. In time, my career led me to an incredible opportunity. My project was receiving recognition, and I was invited to speak at conferences, share my research, and mentor upcoming scientists. Being able to encourage other women in my field became a source of fulfillment and pride. Something that went beyond just career advancement. I had carved out a life that was both meaningful and entirely mine. One evening, after a particularly successful event, I sat in my apartment, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. My apartment had transformed into a true home, a place filled with reminders of my journey. The walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with novels and research materials. Cozy blankets draped over the couch. And a collection of plants that thrived in the sunlit windows. Every inch of the space was a reflection of me. Unfiltered and unapologetic. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I'd find myself reflecting on that intense period of my life with Finn and his family. What had once been a source of pain was now a point of pride. I had faced challenges, navigated betrayal, and emerged stronger. There was no longer any lingering regret. I knew that every decision I'd made had led me to a place of genuine peace and self-acceptance. Then, one spring afternoon, while sorting through some papers, I came across an old envelope tucked into the back of my desk drawer. Inside was a photo of Finn and me from the early days. Back when we'd thought we were building a life together. I stared at it, remembering the dreams I'd held onto back then. I felt a sense of distance, almost like looking at another person's life. There was no anger, just a gentle nostalgia for the person I'd been, a young woman who had yet to learn the depths of her own strength. I slipped the photo back into the envelope, deciding not to throw it away. It was a part of my story. After all, a chapter that had taught me about resilience, self-worth, and the courage it took to walk away from something that no longer served me. That photo would stay hidden, not because I wanted to revisit it, but because it was a reminder of where I'd been and how far I'd come. Years later, as I watched the city lights outside my window, I realized how much my journey had transformed me. The future stretched out, filled with possibility and promise. My life was one I had built, independent of anyone else's expectations. I felt whole, a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and a path that was entirely her own. In that moment, I knew with certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. As time continued to unfold, my life took on a peaceful rhythm, each year filled with growth, new friendships, and moments of quiet fulfillment. I thrived in my work and found myself involved in a community that celebrated each other's achievements. The passion I had poured into my career continued to pay off. Not just in professional success but in the personal pride I felt with every step forward. One evening, after an event where I'd been invited to present my latest research findings, I was approached by a young woman named Kayla. She was just starting her career, eyes wide with the enthusiasm I'd once carried into the field, and she looked at me with a mix of admiration and excitement. "Your story really inspired me," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "It's so refreshing to see someone who built their own path, especially as a woman in this field. I don't think I've ever seen someone who owns her strengths so confidently." Her words struck a chord, resonating deep within me. In that moment, I saw my own journey through her eyes. A journey of persistence, courage, and resilience. I had never intended to serve as an inspiration for others, but seeing the impact my story had on someone else was a reminder of how far I'd come and the value of every decision I'd made. I shared a bit of advice with her, hoping that she'd carry it forward in her own life, and watched as she walked away, her own path waiting for her with promise. It wasn't long after that I received an unexpected message from Mara, my closest friend. She'd been a steadfast support through the most difficult times and had become a true sister over the years. She'd moved to another state recently, but she'd just announced that she was getting married and wanted me to be her maid of honor. I felt a rush of happiness, excited to stand beside her on such a special day. Our friendship had been a source of stability, and it felt like a celebration of both our journeys. When the wedding day arrived, I flew out to be there, feeling the warmth of community as friends and family gathered to celebrate Mara's happiness. It was a day filled with laughter, tears, and memories that I knew we'd cherish for years. Standing by her side, I felt the depth of gratitude for friendships that had weathered every storm. The type of connection that went beyond circumstance. We'd been there for each other in ways I hadn't realized were possible. And I was profoundly grateful. At the reception, as people mingled and danced, Mara pulled me aside, her eyes filled with affection. "I don't know if I've told you this enough," she said, "but seeing you rebuild your life after everything has been one of the most inspiring things. You taught me that no one should ever settle for less than they deserve." Her words filled my heart, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my journey settle. Not as a burden but as a source of quiet pride. I knew I'd walked a hard road. But I'd come through with clarity and purpose. Stronger than I'd ever thought possible. I hugged her, feeling the truth of what she'd said. Grateful for the shared strength between us. As I returned home after the wedding, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd been through. The steps I'd taken to build a life that was uniquely mine. I no longer saw my past as something to move beyond but as a foundation that had shaped who I was. I'd learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. About using those experiences to grow into someone capable of embracing every part of life with open arms. With each passing day, I continued to live with purpose and joy, surrounding myself with people who valued and respected me. My career, my friendships, and even my solitary moments had become sources of contentment and peace. The dreams I'd once shared with Finn had faded, replaced by a vision that was clearer, rooted in my own ambitions and values. Now, when I looked toward the future, I no longer felt bound by fear or doubt. I was free, grounded in the knowledge that I had everything I needed within myself. And as I stood on the threshold of new beginnings, I felt a deep, abiding certainty that this was only the beginning of a life fully and wonderfully lived.